The Carlisle Hotel's grand ballroom gleamed under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off polished marble floors and the elegant attire of Manhattan's elite. Elizabeth Ashford, though she no longer carried that name, stood near the tall windows overlooking Central Park, her black silk gown perfect in every way except for one detail, the slight tremor in her hands as she held her champagne flute. She was supposed to be celebrating the acquisition of her architectural firm's latest major contract, a triumph that would cement her legacy as one of New York's most innovative designers. Instead, she found herself lost in thoughts of a time when her victories had seemed meaningless without one specific person to share them with. The past decade had been carefully constructed. Elizabeth had thrown herself into her work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, building something tangible from the ruins of her personal life. Her firm had become renowned, her designs featured in prestigious magazines, her name whispered among those who understood the subtle art of transforming spaces into experiences. She had friends, admirers, even suitors, yet somehow she remained fundamentally alone. The loneliness had become familiar enough that she barely noticed it anymore, like a shadow that moved with her wherever she went. "Elizabeth, darling, you look absolutely stunning tonight." Margaret Chen, her business partner and closest friend, appeared beside her with 2 fresh glasses of champagne. Margaret was smaller in stature, but formidable in presence, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. She had been with Elizabeth through the worst of it, though she had never pressed for the full story of why her friend carried such carefully concealed sorrow. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. "This evening has exceeded all expectations. The partners seemed genuinely impressed with our vision for the Sustainable Development Project." Margaret laughed softly, a knowing sound. "Elizabeth, you're doing it again. You're reducing a moment of genuine triumph to business metrics. Just allow yourself to feel proud. You've earned this." It was true, but Elizabeth had learned long ago that feeling pride and feeling pain often lived in uncomfortably close proximity. Pride meant acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability meant remembering what she had lost. She was about to respond when Margaret suddenly straightened, her eyes widening slightly as she looked toward the entrance of the ballroom. Something in her friend's expression caused Elizabeth to turn as well. The moment she saw him, time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Adrian stood in the doorway, momentarily silhouetted by the soft lighting beyond. He was unmistakably the same man. The same strong jawline, the same broad shoulders, yet fundamentally altered in ways that Elizabeth's mind struggled to reconcile. His dark hair, once meticulously groomed, carried a streak of premature silver. His face bore new lines, deep grooves around his eyes and mouth that spoke of years spent frowning or bearing weight. He wore his tuxedo with the same natural elegance he had always possessed. Yet his posture suggested a man weary in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, her hand finding Elizabeth's arm. "Is that—" "Yes," Elizabeth managed, though the word felt disconnected from her body. Her heart had begun a frantic rhythm that felt dangerous, as though it might burst from her chest at any moment. 10 years. It had been exactly 10 years since she had last seen Adrian Thorne, the Duke of Ashford, the man who had loved her and then become the reason she had learned to live without love. Adrian's gaze moved across the ballroom with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to surveying rooms, assessing situations, maintaining control. And then his eyes found hers, and in that instant, Elizabeth saw something crack in the carefully maintained facade he wore. Recognition flickered across his features, a moment of vulnerability before his expression hardened, becoming unreadable once more. He looked away, engaging with the social secretary who had rushed to greet him, but Elizabeth had seen enough. Whatever Adrian felt in that moment, he had chosen to conceal it, just as he always had when faced with genuine emotion. Some things, it appeared, did not change, even across a decade of separation and transformation. "You should leave," Margaret said quietly, a statement rather than a suggestion. "I can make an excuse. We can go." Elizabeth shook her head, drawing in a breath that felt both necessary and painful. "No, I'm not running." Though even as she said the words, she questioned their truth. Wasn't that exactly what she had been doing for 10 years? Running from the memory of Adrian, from the feeling of being unmade by love, from the possibility that some people were meant for moments rather than lifetimes. She watched as Adrian moved through the crowd with a grace that seemed automatic, his dark eyes occasionally flickering in her direction before quickly moving away. He was avoiding her as intentionally as he was acknowledging her presence, a paradox that captured the essence of their relationship perfectly. They had always been drawn to each other while simultaneously being forced to resist that pull. The evening continued around them, a ballet of sophisticated conversation and calculated networking. Elizabeth fulfilled her obligations, accepted congratulations, and maintained the facade of the composed, successful professional she had become. Yet beneath this performance, her awareness of Adrian's presence in the room remained absolute, as though some part of her had been calibrated to his existence in a way that time and distance had failed to recalibrate. It was close to midnight when Adrian finally approached her. She was standing alone. Margaret had tactfully excused herself 15 minutes earlier, and there was no avoiding the encounter. He materialized from the crowd with the same silent efficiency he had always possessed, a skill developed over years of moving through high society with grace and power. "Elizabeth," he said, and hearing her name spoken in his voice created a sensation, like falling. "It's been a long time." She turned to face him fully, gathering every ounce of composure she possessed. This man was a stranger, and the one person she had known most intimately. He was the past she had buried, and the future she had once believed was certain. His eyes, she noticed, were the same shade of grey-green they had always been, yet they held no warmth, only a polite recognition one might extend to a passing acquaintance. "Adrian," she replied, her voice betraying none of the chaos within. "I didn't know you were back in New York." "It was a necessary return," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Business requires my attention here for the next several months." He paused, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, a question, a regret, a longing. But then his expression reasserted its iron control. "You've been successful. I've seen your work featured in several publications." The conversation was the kind one might have with an old colleague, pleasant, superficial, utterly devoid of the history that lay between them. Elizabeth found this more painful than any confrontation could have been, that Adrian could stand before her and speak as though their shared past had been nothing more than a pleasant acquaintance made real, the loss in ways she had not fully confronted in 10 years. "Thank you," she said. "And you? I imagine the dukedom has kept you occupied." Something flickered across his face at this, a tightness around his jaw, a shadow in his eyes. "The dukedom," he repeated quietly, "has been my penance." Before Elizabeth could respond to this cryptic statement, Adrian inclined his head in a gesture of farewell. "It was good to see you again, Elizabeth. Perhaps we'll encounter each other at various functions during my stay." Perhaps we will, she thought, watching him disappear back into the crowd. But as she stood alone once more, Elizabeth understood that this was not truly a goodbye. It was, rather, a beginning of a different kind, the reopening of a door that she had worked a decade to seal shut. The question was no longer whether she could survive Adrian's presence in New York. The question was whether either of them could survive the truth about why they had been separated in the first place. The architectural office occupied the entire 32nd floor of a glass and steel building in Midtown, a space Elizabeth had designed herself as a reflection of her philosophy: clean lines, natural light, and the careful balance between structure and possibility. Yet in the 3 days following the gala, this space that usually felt like sanctuary had become a prison of distraction. Elizabeth stood before the large digital displays showcasing her firm's current projects, her mind present only in the barest sense. The sustainable development project they had won was magnificent. Green spaces integrated throughout, renewable energy systems, community-focused design that emphasized human connection and environmental responsibility. It was, in many ways, the culmination of everything she had worked toward. Yet she found herself staring at the renderings without truly seeing them. "You've looked at that same section for 5 minutes without moving," Margaret observed from the doorway, a cup of coffee in each hand. She extended one to Elizabeth. "And you've been checking your phone every 30 seconds since 8 this morning, which means Adrian either called or you were hoping he would." Elizabeth accepted the coffee but didn't respond immediately. The truth was that Adrian had not called, had not contacted her in any way beyond their brief exchange at the gala, and yet she had researched him, a mortifying fact she had not admitted to anyone. According to public records and society pages, Adrian remained the Duke of Ashford, though he spent most of his time in London managing the family's estates and investments. He had never married, a detail that society columns had exhausted with speculation over the years. He had become increasingly reclusive, known for his philanthropical work, but rarely seen at social functions. There was mention of an accident several years ago, something that had left him hospitalized, but details were scarce. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elizabeth said finally, but the conviction in her voice was unconvincing even to her own ears. Margaret laughed, not unkindly, and settled into one of the high-backed chairs near the window. "Elizabeth, I've known you for 8 years. In that time, I've never seen you rattled by anything. You negotiated with some of the most difficult developers in the city without flinching. You redesigned an entire community center while managing a divorce lawsuit from a previous client. But one sighting of your mysterious ex and you're falling apart." "I'm not falling apart," Elizabeth protested, though her hands betrayed her by trembling slightly as she lifted the coffee cup to her lips. "I'm simply processing the unexpected encounter with someone from my past." "You're in love with him," Margaret said quietly. "Still, after 10 years. And seeing him has made you remember how much that love hurt when it ended." Elizabeth set down the coffee with careful precision. The direct observation of a truth she had been avoiding cut through her defenses like a blade. "That was a long time ago. I'm not the same person I was then, and neither is he." "Exactly," Margaret agreed. "Which makes it more complicated, not less. People change. Sometimes they grow apart, but sometimes—" She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging between them. Before Elizabeth could respond, her assistant's voice came through the intercom system. "Miss Ashford, there's a gentleman here to see you. Adrian Thorne, Duke of Ashford. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's being quite insistent." The world seemed to stop. In the silence that followed the announcement, Elizabeth could hear the sounds of the city below. Horns, sirens, the distant rhythm of millions of lives being lived simultaneously. Margaret stood up, her expression a mixture of amusement and something deeper, compassion perhaps, or the understanding of a friend watching someone walk toward their own fate. "I'll tell him you'll see him," she said, moving toward the door. "Wait!" Elizabeth called out, then stopped herself. There was nothing she could tell Margaret to say, no message that would change what was about to happen. She took a moment to steady herself, smoothing her hair and composing her expression into the professional facade she wore so well. By the time Adrian entered her office, she was the perfect picture of polished composure. He looked different in daylight, more real somehow than he had in the ballroom's forgiving illumination. The lines on his face were more pronounced, and there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested chronic pain, though whether physical or emotional, Elizabeth could not determine. He wore a charcoal suit tailored to precise perfection, yet she noticed that his left hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he carried it. "Adrian," she said, rising from her desk, "this is unexpected." "I know," he replied, and his voice carried an undertone of something, frustration perhaps, or resignation. I've attempted multiple times to come here since the gala. Each time I've convinced myself it was inadvisable and turned around at the curb. Today, I failed to exercise that restraint. There was something almost vulnerable in this admission, a crack in the perfect control he maintained. Elizabeth gestured to one of the chairs facing her desk, and after a moment's hesitation, Adrian accepted the invitation. They sat in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with 10 years of unspoken things. Elizabeth found herself cataloguing small changes. The grey in his hair was more pronounced than she had initially noticed, and there was a scar, thin and pale, that ran from his temple to just below his eye. I saw your work, Adrian said finally. The community centre in Queens. Your firm designed it. Yes, Elizabeth confirmed. We won the bid 3 years ago. It's been quite successful. The community programs operating there have had better outcomes than initially projected. Adrian nodded slowly. It's beautiful. I attended the opening ceremony, though I remained in the back. You wouldn't have seen me. The way you've designed the spaces, it shows a profound understanding of human need, the attention to natural light, the gathering spaces that encourage genuine connection rather than just proximity. It's remarkable. The compliment struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. This was the Adrian she remembered, the man who looked deeply, who understood not just the mechanics of things, but their emotional architecture. Thank you, she said quietly. Architecture is, in many ways, about creating spaces where people can be authentically themselves, where they can find moments of peace or connection or growth. Yes, Adrian agreed. Though I suspect you understand that better than most, having spent a decade constructing such spaces while isolating yourself from human connection. The observation struck like a physical blow. Elizabeth felt colour rise in her cheeks, felt her hands curl into fists beneath the desk. You have no right— I don't, Adrian interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. You're absolutely correct. I have no right to make observations about your life, your choices, your pain. I relinquished that right a decade ago when I allowed you to leave without fighting for you. The words hung between them, and with them came the floodgates of everything they had not said in 10 years. The office fell silent except for the ambient sounds of the city filtering through the windows. Adrian sat back in his chair, and Elizabeth noticed that the tremor in his hand had increased. He was, she realized, operating under tremendous emotional stress, working to maintain composure just as she was. Why did you come here? Elizabeth asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not to my office today, but back to New York. Back to the places where we existed together. Adrian's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and the sprawling cityscape beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he clearly wished he did not feel. My father died 8 months ago. The title, the estates, all of it fell to me completely. I spent the better part of 2 years working to absolve myself of any connection to you, any thought of you, any hope of understanding what happened between us. I told myself that some endings were necessary, that we had been wrong for each other, that the separation had been for the best. He paused, and Elizabeth could see the effort it took for him to continue. But grief has a way of clarifying things. When faced with death, with the end of a life, you begin to understand what actually matters. And I realize that I have spent a decade running from one of the only things that ever truly mattered to me. Elizabeth felt tears beginning to form, though she fought to maintain her composure. Your father never approved of me. He made that abundantly clear. He said I was unsuitable, that a duke could not possibly build a life with a woman of my background. My father was a frightened old man who confused control with love, Adrian said bitterly. After my mother died, he became obsessed with maintaining the family's standing, with ensuring that nothing would tarnish the Ashford name. And yes, he made his disapproval of you known. He threatened to remove me from the line of succession if I pursued a relationship with you. He said he would disinherit me, transfer everything to my cousin Richard. You never told me that, Elizabeth said, shock rippling through her voice. You said we simply weren't compatible, that we wanted different things from life. Adrian looked at her then, and in his grey-green eyes she saw a reflection of the anguish that had clearly consumed him for years, because telling you the truth seemed crueler. If you knew my father was threatening disinheritance, you would have insisted I fight him, argued that we didn't need the money or the title. And I was not brave enough to risk everything for you. I was afraid, Elizabeth. I was young and privileged and utterly terrified of losing the identity that had been constructed for me since birth. He stood up, abruptly, and walked to the window. His hands braced against the glass as though he needed something to anchor him to reality. Do you know what it's like to spend 10 years proving to yourself that you made the right choice, only to discover that every argument you constructed was nothing but elaborate justification for cowardice? Elizabeth found herself standing as well, drawn to him by something more powerful than pride or self-preservation. She approached carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal. When she spoke, her voice carried only truth. I made choices too, Adrian. I chose to believe that moving forward without you was the only way to survive. I chose to build a life, a career, an identity that didn't include you. And I did survive, but I never really lived after you left. Adrian turned from the window, and the expression on his face was raw, the careful mask completely gone. Then why did you become so successful? Why did you build something so remarkable? Because success was easier than happiness, Elizabeth admitted. Because achievement could be measured and quantified and presented as evidence that I was fine, that I had moved on, that losing you hadn't fundamentally broken something inside me. But the truth is that I have spent 10 years building walls so high and so thick that no one could ever get close enough to hurt me the way you did. The space between them seemed to contract, the air becoming thick and charged. Adrian reached out, his trembling hand finding her cheek, his touch so gentle that it felt almost like a question. I am not the man you loved, he said quietly. The accident I had 5 years ago, I was hospitalized for 3 months. There was nerve damage, physical pain that I still manage every day, and the emotional damage. Elizabeth, I spent years in therapeutic treatment for depression, for PTSD, for the accumulated weight of choices I regretted. I am not whole. I may never be whole again. I know, Elizabeth said, placing her hand over his. I can see it in your eyes, in the way you carry yourself. But you're here. You came back. That counts for something. It counts for nothing if I can't give you what you deserve, Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly. If I can't offer you the kind of love that doesn't come with shadow and pain and the constant fear that I will fail you again. Elizabeth turned her head, pressing her lips briefly against his palm. Adrian, I don't need perfection. I never did. I just needed you. And yes, it's been 10 years. Yes, we've both changed. But I need to know if there's any possibility that you came back to New York for more than just business. I need to know if there's any possibility that you came back for me. The moment stretched between them, 10 years compressed into a single instant of decision. And then Adrian drew her into his arms, careful and tender, as though she were made of something fragile. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt him tremble. I came back for you, he whispered. God forgive me. I came back for you. 3 months passed. It was not a simple return to what they had been before. That would have been impossible, and neither of them wanted the regression such a thing would represent. Instead, what emerged was something new, something built deliberately and carefully on the foundation of their history, but not bound by it. They began with honesty. Long conversations in Elizabeth's apartment, in quiet restaurants, in the spaces Adrian was slowly learning to inhabit again after so many years of isolation. He told her about the accident, a riding injury that had left him with chronic pain and a profound loss of confidence. He described the depression that had followed, the months of darkness when he had genuinely questioned whether life was worth the effort of continuing. He shared his grief over his father, the complicated legacy of a man he had both loved and resented. Elizabeth, in turn, shared the details of her own decade, the men she had briefly believed she might love, but who could never quite fit into the space in her heart that Adrian had occupied. The professional successes that felt hollow without someone to truly share them with. The moments of terrible loneliness, even when surrounded by people. The realization that she had been running not from love, but toward a life that felt safe and small. One evening, as they sat on the terrace of her apartment overlooking Central Park, Adrian took her hand and examined it with careful attention, as though seeing it for the first time. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly, "and I need you to answer with complete honesty. If I had not come back to New York, if we had never encountered each other again, would you have built a full life? Would you have eventually found someone who could make you happy?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said finally, "I believe I would have. It would have taken more time, perhaps many more years, but I would have eventually accepted that some people are not meant to be permanent fixtures in our lives. I would have grieved what we were and built something new from that grief." "But you would not have been happy," Adrian said, and it was not a question. "No," Elizabeth confirmed. "I would have been successful, secure, and surrounded by people who cared about me. But I would not have experienced the kind of joy that makes you feel alive in your bones, that makes you believe the universe makes sense. That specific kind of happiness belonged only to moments I had shared with you." Adrian was silent for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I have carried this with me for 3 months," he said. "I purchased it from a jeweler in London before I flew to New York. I was not sure how to give it to you, or if I had the right to ask what I am about to ask. But I am tired of living in the past. I am tired of punishing myself for the choices I made when I was young and afraid. And I am profoundly tired of living without you." He opened the box to reveal an engagement ring, not ostentatious or dramatic, but elegant and personal, bearing a clarity and beauty that spoke to the quietness of truth. "Elizabeth Ashford," he said, using her birth surname deliberately. "I cannot promise you that I will be the man I was before the accident, before the pain, before the accumulated weight of years spent trying to forget you. I cannot promise that there will not be difficult days, or that I will not struggle with things that are currently beyond my comprehension. But I can promise you that I will spend every remaining day of my life working to be worthy of the love you have shown me, in finding this courage to return to you. Will you marry me? Will you allow me the honor of building a new life with you, not as the people we were, but as the people we have become?" Elizabeth found that she could not speak. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, and when Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt something fundamental shift in her chest. Not a healing exactly, but an acknowledgement that wounds could become scars, and scars could become stories that made you stronger rather than weaker. In the weeks that followed, they began the practical work of integrating their lives. Adrian purchased an apartment in Manhattan, a space that was slowly being transformed as Elizabeth designed it to reflect both of their sensibilities. They spoke to therapists separately and together to navigate the complicated emotional terrain of rebuilding a relationship that had been broken by choices made from a place of fear. There were still difficult moments. Adrian struggled with physical pain that required medication and management. He had nightmares occasionally, remnants of the trauma he had endured. Elizabeth had to learn to balance her need for independence with her desire to support him, to understand that accepting help was not weakness, but rather a form of genuine intimacy.